Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our lecture today will be about the development of the face. The development of the face usually starts between 5 and 8 weeks of embryogenesis. The lower jaw, which is the mandible, it's the first part of the face that starts to form, about 4 weeks duration. The proportion of the face develop during the fetal period, about 9th week until birth. During infancy and childhood, following the development of teeth and paranasal sinuses, usually the facial skeleton increases in size. This contributes to the definite shape of the face. Here you can see the embryo, lateral view of the embryo, about 4 to 5 weeks. Here are the pharyngeal arches. All of them are here. Here is the developing head region, and this is the developing heart. Here is the site of the stomodium, or the primitive mouth. This is the stomodium, the primitive oral cavity, and this is the maxillary processes from both sides. This is one, and this is the second. These two maxillary prominences or processes, and this is the mandibular process. Both of these processes arise from the first pharyngeal arch, which is named the mandibular arch. This is the frontonasal prominence. So these 5 prominences participate in the development of the face. Again, this is the frontonasal prominence, 2 maxillary prominences, and the mandibular prominence. This is the frontonasal prominence. It's a single process, paired or 2 maxillary prominences, and this is the mandibular prominence, as I mentioned before. This is the frontal view, and this is lateral view of the same structures. This is the stomodium. So these 5 prominences surround the stomodium, or the primitive oral cavity. Other name is the oropharyngeal or the buccopharyngeal membrane. Here it appears in this area. Later on it will rupture, stop growing and ruptures. So will be connection between the oral cavity and the primitive digestive tract. The stomodium is defined as the ectoderm-lined depression, separated from the primitive pharynx by the membrane, as I mentioned before, or the oropharyngeal membrane. This will later breaks down, and the stomodium opens into the pharynx, which is the beginning of the digestive tract. At the end of the 4th week, these ectodermal thickenings arise at the lower part of the frontonasal prominence. This is the frontonasal prominence. This is the lower side of it, and here we can see the nasal prominences or the nasal placots. These are ectodermal thickenings. These are the primordia of the nasal cavities. Mesenchymal cells proliferate at the margin of the placots. As you can see, these are the site of the nasal placots. Then mesenchymal cells will proliferate at these margins. This leads to the formation of horseshoe-shaped structure, this one, on both sides. This is the horseshoe-shaped structure or swelling around these areas, around these placots. These are called the medial. This is the medial nasal placot, and this is the lateral from both sides. This is the lateral nasal prominence, and this is the other one. Here is the medial, and this is the other medial nasal prominence. Now, these placots are named nasal pits. This is due to the proliferation of the surrounding area. So it will appear as a depression. The nasal placot changed into nasal pits on both sides, due to the proliferation of the surrounding tissue, forming the medial and lateral nasal prominences. You can see this is lateral nasal prominence, and this is the maxillary prominence, separated by the nasolacrimal groove. This is the nasolacrimal groove on other side. Here again, the developing embryo, you can see the prominences that participate in the formation of the face surrounding the primitive mouth cavity. This is the frontonasal prominence, 2 maxillary, and the mandibular prominence. And this is the developing heart. Here, at the 5th week of development, the nasal pit develop. These are the nasal pits. As you can see, this area, these are the nasal pits. And here again, also the pits, you can see these are the nasal pit. This is one, and this is the other side. They appear sited at the middle part of the developing face due to the growth of the surrounding structures. This is scan electron microscope of the developing face. This is the frontonasal prominences, and this is the nasal pit on both sides, surrounded by the medial nasal prominence and the lateral nasal prominences. As you can see, these are the nasal prominences. This is the maxillary prominence, and this is the mandible. Here you can see the stomodium of the primitive mouth cavity. It's a mouse embryo about 6 weeks of age. This maxillary prominence will continue to grow and increase in size. Laterally, you can see this maxillary prominence merges with the mandibular prominence here. This is the maxillary prominence. At this side, it merges or it fuses with the mandibular prominence, forming the cheek, this area. You can see this is the maxilla and the mandible fused together or merged together, forming the cheek. Whereas the medial side of the maxillary prominence, you can see it compresses the medial and lateral. This is the medial nasal prominence, the yellow color. Due to the growth of these maxillary prominences toward the medial side, this will push two medial nasal processes toward each other, and they fuse finally at the midline. They are pushed together and they fuse at the midline, forming the upper lip. So the upper lip is formed by the two medial nasal prominences at two maxillary prominences. This occurs due to the continuous growth of these two maxillary prominences. These medial nasal prominences, when they fuse, they will grow medially and merge with each other at the midline, forming a structure known as the intermaxillary segment. This is the scan electron microscope of the same structure. This is the intermaxillary segment that arises due to the merging of the two medial nasal prominences. This is the nasal pit. This is one. This is the second medial nasal prominences. This is the site of fusion. Here is the lateral nasal prominences. This is the maxilla and one side, and this is the other side. Here is the mandible. You can see the mouth is broad, still so broad. This is the intermaxillary segment, as you can see in this picture. The nasolacrimal groove, as I mentioned, appears due to the fusion of the developing maxillary prominences with the nasal prominences. The intermaxillary segment, it gives rise to certain structures. First, the philtrum of the lip, premaxillary part of the maxilla that carries the 4 incisor teeth, and the primary palate. This is the intermaxillary segment. Here, the philtrum of the lip, this part of the maxilla holding the 4 incisor teeth, and the primary palate. This primary palate later on will fuse with the secondary palate. Both form the roof of the mouth, separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. Now, the mesenchyme or the mesenchymal tissue of the first and second pairs of the pharyngeal arches. They invade the facial prominences and give rise to the muscles of mastication and muscles of facial expression. As you know that the first pharyngeal arch gives rise of some of the muscles of mastication, whereas the second pharyngeal arch gives rise to the muscles of facial expression. Besides the fleshy derivatives of these arches, the facial prominences also give rise to the bones of the facial skeleton. As you know previously that each pharyngeal arch gives skeletal parts, muscles, and also each one is supplied by its own nerve and artery. The frontonasal prominence forms the forehead and the bridge of the nose. These are derivatives of each part of the facial components. The maxillary prominence form the upper cheek region when it fuses with the mandible, and most of the upper lip when it fuses with the medial nasal prominence. Also gives maxilla, zygomatic bone, secondary palate. Whereas the mandibular prominence fuse from two sides, they fuse at the midline, forming the chin, the lower lip, lower cheek region. The lower cheek region arises from its fusion with the maxillary prominence, also the mandible. The lateral nasal prominence forms the awl of the nose, whereas the medial nasal prominence is fused at the midline, forming the intermaxillary segment, as I mentioned before, which gives three structures, which are the philtrum of the lip, maxillary part of the maxilla, which carries the four incisor teeth, and also the primary palate. Now we are going to talk about the development of the nasal cavity. With the formation of the medial and lateral nasal prominences, the nasal placodes seem to lie in the floor of the depressions called the nasal pits. Here is the medial nasal prominences, and these are the lateral nasal prominences. At the middle of these two processes is the nasal pit. Originally, it was named the nasal placode. By the end of the sixth week, these nasal pits deepen and they form nasal sacs. These nasal sacs grow in certain direction, which is the dorsocaudal direction, ventral to the developing brain. This is the nasal sac, as you can see. The direction of the growth of these nasal sacs is the dorsocaudally. At the beginning, these nasal sacs, they are separated from the oral cavity. This is the oral cavity. These are nasal sacs. They are separated by this oronasal membrane. As you can see, this membrane separates between the nasal sac from the oral cavity. This membrane later on ruptures at about 7th week. This will give communication or joining between the oral. Here is the tearing or the rupturing of this membrane. This will lead to the joining or communication between the primitive nasal cavities and the oral cavity. This communication between the nasal cavity and the mouth is named the primitive choana. It's located posterior to the primary palate. This is a primary palate. Later on, when the secondary palate develops, it fused with the primary palate. The choana, the choana changes its position. It will be located at the junction of the nasal cavity with the pharynx. Here is the site of the primitive choana at the beginning. Later on, it will be pushed posteriorly, named as the definitive choana, between the nasal cavity and the pharynx. The nasal septum develops as a downgrowth from the internal parts of the merged medial nasal prominences. It fuses with the palatine process superior to the hard palate primordium. This is the nasal septum. As you can see in this picture, here is again the nasal septum. It appears as a downgrowth from the internal medial nasal prominences. The nasolacrimal duct appears as a rod-like thickening of ectodermal tissue. In the floor of the nasolacrimal groove, it appears as a salt cord of cells separates from the surface ectoderm and lies in the underlying mesenchyme. This will later on be canalized to form the nasolacrimal duct. The cranial end of the duct expands to form the lacrimal sac, whereas the caudal end opens into inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. This duct becomes patently only after birth. If failure of complete canalization occurs of this duct, this will lead to atresia of the duct. Appears in about 6% of newborn infants. Thank you.